Chapter 48 True Things. It was not the sea. This pool of water was finite, it sang a simple song. Kentucky's ocean was infinite, a chorus of many elves singing together as one, multitudes within a vast expanse of possibility. But the salty embrace was still familiar, and its kiss awakened memories already half forgotten, seagrass waving around her ankles, ridged shells beneath her fingertips, claw-cracked oysters, the taste of those delicacies upon her tongue. And fishes swimming all around, silver scales shining in the moonlight, greedy for their share. Deeper, sang the water. Her heart ached for her ocean nest, but she would sink to the coldest depths of this pool. White-hot recollections of biting air and burning wind shivered together in her mind, and she wished to hide from them. The still surface closed over her head, soothing her pain and gently tousling her hair. Kentucky sighed, bubbles rushing past her face, so that she would sink yet further. The darkness was good. She craved the darkness. It would hide her thoughts, shelter her battered body, while she remembered herself. Deeper. But just as the pads of her toes touched the slimy floor, something tightened around her wrist, calling her attention outward. A hand. Its singing pulse quickened and stuttered, drumming against her palm. She had been snatched like this before, many times, yes, she could smell the bitter fragrance of her sister even now. Kentucky pulled away, but that hand would not let go. It did not force her to the surface, but neither did it reach any further. It simply held her. She opened an eye beneath the water, the one which pained her least, and peered into the murk. The scent which she could taste, impressed upon her skin and trailing through the salt and gloom, was not her sister's sultry scent, of sage and bitter pine. Instead, it was the heady musk of man. Her lips parted and she drew that hand nearer. Familiar. And warm. Deeper, lulled the salt and cold. But those rough fingers squeezed her gently, a promise without words. She shivered. The touch filled her with an unquenchable curiosity, an innate longing for a precious and mysterious thing which she had all but forgotten, and she felt very strongly that she should not have forgotten it. Once she recovered herself, she would surely remember to whom that heartbeat belonged. How they had come together to the embrace of this dark refuge. At last, Kentucky relented, and wrapped her fingers round his wrist in turn. Ember. Twisted forests, hideous laughter, and a tangle of crimson hair fled his mind in a whirl, and everything around him turned to darkness. He blinked rapidly, but the darkness did not ebb. The summons returned, a breath cooling his ear. Ember. He bolted upright, fumbling. Kentucky? Two cold, wet hands gripped his wrist, thumbs smoothing over his palm and fingers winding with his. He shivered as a very real voice croaked, "I am here." The water rippled quietly. For a moment, he couldn't speak, his throat was too tight, his breaths too shallow, and he could not find the words to explain his relief. Kentucky merely explored his hand with her nimble fingers, finding every cut and welt upon his knuckles. "When I first awake, I think myself in death," she whispered at last, her voice washing over him like rain after a drought, "but your scent is here with me, and I am knowing it cannot be so." He lifted his other hand, searching for her face in the darkness, and then realized that he didn't know what he would do once he had found it. "Ember," Kentucky murmured, folding their hands together and sparing him the trouble. "Where are we?" "Someplace called the Salt Baths," he said, edging closer. "Try to tell you, before you ran away. I think people would come, sometimes, to wash themselves. We should be safe here. For now." Her response was not long in coming. "Thank you." Chills skittered across the back of his neck as she repeated herself in those strange twisty words which belonged to siren tongues alone. "Of course," he mumbled, suddenly compelled to speak his dreary thoughts aloud. "Can't really even begin to describe to you how afraid I was, that you would leave me alone, I mean, in the dark." Kentucky's grasp loosened, and then she withdrew. Ember ducked his head. He wondered why given voice to those worries, and then realized uncomfortably that he wished for reassurance. For her soothing words. What must she think of me now? Sel's gilded insults still echoed in his mind. Nothing but a little boy, after all. Water rippled as Kentucky shifted along the ledge. Stone scraped against stone. A faint light appeared before him, dim at first, like a firefly. It flickered and swelled until he could discern thin fingers forming a cage about the golden stone. Light shone through the delicate skin between her knuckles, and then cast its soft glow upon her face. She blew quietly on the resin, stroking it with her fingertips, coaxing the light from within. As the light brightened, he glimpsed a mottling of pale pinkish discoloration around her neck and shoulders, partially hidden by strands of black hair. More alarming were the faint vein-like patterns beneath the surface, like cracked pottery glazing. It reminded him starkly of the wicked siren, but these lines were fewer and softer, more silvery than gray. Before he could remark on them, or decide whether to remark at all, Kentucky looked away from the stone and he was caught up in her glance. "I am here," she repeated, very firmly, holding the stone out to him, "and you shall not be alone, nor in the dark." Ember grasped it in quiet surprise. Kentucky gingerly folded her arms on the ledge and leaned closer, hair pressed along her neck and floating around her shoulders in the cloudy water. Softly shattered, near to breaking, still somehow both sane and whole. Water plinked quietly in the back of the room. "Ember, please hear me. When I am running away from you, then, it is only—" "I know why you ran," he said stiffly. "You were hungry. You didn't want to hurt me. You don't need to be sorry for that." Yet it was only with great effort that he dredged up each word. It felt wrong somehow, to say that she needn't be sorry, after Syl's gloating delight. The notion of that otherworldly witch skulking across the craggy peaks and lying in wait beside the gate chilled him to the marrow of his bones. "I have to tell Kentucky about my dreams." The thought turned his mouth sour with dread. Yet his recent brush with death had persuaded him. "If something happens to me, before we get free of this mountain, she needs to know to be careful, to know that her sister is still out there looking for her." He exhaled a shaking breath, closing his fingers around the glowing stone. "Do you remember when I told you about dreams? And you asked to sing for me?" An irrelevant question, of course she would remember. But she merely stroked his bloody knuckles and pressed them to her cheek. The cold and damp of her skin soothed his welts. It was an entirely innocent gesture, but he wondered if she knew that it made his heart beat faster. "Not long after we came to this mountain, well, you know, I found a place to hide. I think it was sacred to the men who lived here, once. Anyway, I saw something there. It was like a dream, but real. I think maybe it's called a vision. And I met someone in that vision." Kentucky continued to ponder his welts, running her fingers over them and humming very quietly to herself. "Listening. Ever since that day, she has been coming to me in my dreams somehow. A sirena like you, with long red hair. Her voice is like that song we heard in the woods, near the mountain's door. She is." Ember ducked his head, ashamed without quite knowing why. "Very beautiful." The humming ceased. Her claws pressed into his palm, and dark eyes glittered at him in the stone light. "She calls herself Sylvie." He watched Kentucky carefully. "That is your sister's name." He was surprised at the weight which lifted from him as he spoke those words. Yet in the next moment he felt ashamed for speaking them at all, for that same weight which had fled him seemed to settle upon Kentucky instead. Her shoulders slumped and she dipped deeper into the bath. "Yes," she murmured, eyes downcast. Ember waited for a further comment or rebuttal, and was alarmed when none came. "You don't doubt me?" One shoulder shrugged faintly. "Why doubt my Ember? You were never speaking falsely to me." Her words were touched with an unexpected sorrow. It struck him cold. "Never," he agreed, and winced, taken up by the remembrance of his rage in the garden. Surely a flattering word or two would uplift her spirits. "But when you sing to me, I can feel your presence there. Your song keeps her away, though I glimpse her now and then. A shadow at the edge of my dream." She moved a little closer, the water swirling around her, but did not look up at him. "Does she sing for you?" she whispered faintly. "Sometimes," he admitted. "The song I heard in the woods." More faintly still, "Does she speak of me?" Ember nodded, but said nothing at first, carefully mulling over his thoughts before he freed them. He would make no mention of Bren, Not yet. No, he would give her a chance to tell him what had happened. Perhaps the truth of it was much different than the story Sol had spun for him. Yes. She told me that you ran far away, but she didn't tell me why. It matters little. I think she means to reach the other side of Sister's Mountain before we do, and wait for us there. Catch you, and take you back with her. He swallowed the rest of Sol's sinister threats. He would spare Kentucky the guilt of that unless it should, by some grave misfortune, come to pass. Then he pressed, "Why do you hide from them?" Kentucky hummed nervously and turned his hands over, quietly playing with each of his fingers. He might have thought it strange from someone else, but it did not seem out of line with her youthful manner, so he allowed the contact, hoping she couldn't see the corners of his mouth curling upward in the darkness. At last she sighed so deeply he thought she would never reach the end of it. "I do not tell you all the true things, Ember, there is more. True Things Part 2. Kentucky drew herself out of the bath very suddenly, water sloshing over Ember's arms. "Wait, what? My things," she said stiffly, waving a hand. Suddenly she was before him, dark hair clinging to her bosom. More was presented to him in that fleeting glimpse than he had seen since she ducked beneath the spring runoff on their way up the mountain. She wrapped her arms around herself a moment later, sheltering her abalone figure from his startled gaze, and cast her glance about anxiously. Ember's mouth opened, and then shut, and then opened again without his consent. He managed to return his attention to her face, though it required an immense effort of will to keep his eyes affixed to it. Here, you can have this." Blushing, he shrugged out of his tattered, sweat-stained shirt and tugged the hem free of his belt. It landed on the ground with a dull rustle. Kentucky spared it a scornful glance, still holding out one insistent hand. "Where are my things?" Ember hesitated for a moment, blushing more fiercely, and then reached behind the leather pack and soared, tossing her worn garments into view. Kentucky delicately plucked the jerkin from the stone tiles. Torn laces slipped from her fingers and crumpled to the stone. "Scent," she murmured. Her lips were thin, the words softly spoken. Of all the things she might have said he least expected that. "Why?" he asked, before he could think twice. She hesitated. "I keep this for a long time. I confess myself surprised it hasn't entirely rotted away by now," Ember stated wryly, "given your affection for rivers and the like. Not always wearing this. Only when I am with your people." Then she relented, the words tumbling from her lips almost without thought. "It is a gift." "Gifts mean friendship," she had told him, once. "Well," he offered, watching her closely, "I'm sure he'd understand." Kentucky's piercing stare flashed back to Ember and she tightened her grip on the jerkin. "What is your meaning?" He shrugged, rubbing the back of his neck and gesturing to the ruined garment. "Only that it was a useful gift and served its purpose, I suppose." "What do you mean?" He would understand. Her tone chilled him. Clearly it had been a mistake to push for more about Bren. Thinking quickly, he fumbled what he hoped was a sensible excuse. "These things you wear. They are men's clothes, aren't they?" "It only stands to reason." She stared back in silence. Lifting her chin, she flung the ruined jerkin aside and smoothed her hand against the tattered folds of Ember's old shirt, upraising it with something like renewed appreciation, and another emotion which was more difficult to identify. Her mouth twitched and her aspect tightened as a claw snagged one of the tatters where she had snatched at his back in the Hall of Mirrors. "Turn away now," she sniffed, dipping her chin, "while I am making myself decent." He wondered who had taught her that phrase. For that matter, who had imparted the small bit of human culture which she seemed determined to emulate, niceties which Sol completely disregarded even in his dreams. Bren, perhaps? But it would do him little good to dwell upon it. There were other questions in his mind which needed answering first, and he had no wish to upset her further with that particular line of inquiry. So he sat facing the inky darkness, his legs crossed, elbows on his knees, chin propped on his folded hands. "You said there are more true things to be spoken. I hope you intend to start with whatever happened between you and your sister?" "Yes." The water sloshed and he heard the slap of bare feet on stone. Her musk washed over him, more potent than he remembered. Like a bruised flower. I will tell you what I can. Though, perhaps things are different now. For it is, and she hummed 10 quick notes, this many summers since last I am singing with my clan. 10 summers. Ember would have been a mere child, yet Kentucky had been 92 years old at the time of his vision. He passed a hand across his face, slightly overwhelmed by the reminder of their discrepancy in age. What have you been doing all that time, since you left? Hiding from my sister, she admitted softly. For she does not understand. And searching for this mountain. Before he is taken. The elder tells me true things in secret. He whispers to me, if our clan will not hear him, that I must be finding the mountain with 2 heads. There, I must seek a man who will return our treasure to us, to me. I try to speak with Syl, many times. Make her see. She will not listen. She tells the clan of my words. And the elder is taken away. That part of the story was familiar to Ember, but now he realized she must feel some degree of responsibility for his death, after confiding in her sister. He wondered if she had personally witnessed the elder's execution. Hatred for the red-haired Sirena swelled within him, but he swallowed it. Angry words would do little to console her. So Ember sat for a long while, arms crossed, but there was only silence. At length, Kentucky made a sticky noise in the back of her throat, a sound he recognized as distress, and he felt compelled to say something. After he was gone. Then what happened? She let out a faint breath, as if his words had reawakened her. Soon after is the day of my becoming. Your becoming? Ah, Kentucky huffed, her claws anxiously tapping. I do not know how to say it. My rising up? When you are no longer a lesser, become your own self. Become. Of the clan. Ember shifted uncomfortably on the stone. The sentiment reminded him of the morning he had been taken into the woods by Alden to hunt his first deer at the age of 14. Despite an entire summer of determined practice, it had taken him several arrows to finally fell the stag. He would never forget the way it foundered and collapsed in a heap, dark blood soaking the soil as the life drained from its body. Alden had proclaimed him a man that day, and Ember had never again gone hunting with a bow. I think I understand, he decided quietly. What does this becoming mean for you? It is different for each of my kin. Most become when they have not seen so many summers. He heard her fidgeting behind him, wriggling into his shirt. Those who become sooner bend more voices within my clan. I am not permitted when I am younger, for I am not fit to have a voice, then. Why not? Her voice dipped lower in sorrow. Or shame. Syl does not find me worthy. Ember frowned into his hands. Why did you listen to her? What does she know? We are the last of our kin, and I know no other guardian than she. Sometimes I think that perhaps, because she is the eldest, she is granted too much wisdom and there is none left for me. There was a gentle ruffle of cloth, and Kentucky sniffed again. I am decent. He glanced over his shoulder with a quickness that embarrassed him, but she was not looking back. Instead, the Sirena knelt on the gritty stone, dirty fabric draped across her thighs. She tugged at the sleeves, which she had always kept rolled, until they came down over her knuckles. Only the ends of her black claws gleamed in the glow of the stone. Understand that to become is to prove your worth as a hunter. That you are worthy of tasting the forever song. She looked down, shoulders tense beneath his shirt, and hesitated. It is the song of men, of which I am speaking. The forever song. Kentucky was always speaking of songs, songs of the earth, songs of her people, but he felt somehow that this was different. An echo of her recitation filled his mind, memories from the Hall of Mounted Treasure where they had found the ancient siren, the words of her own tongue etched forever beside the heads of Ember's fallen kin. We wish their bones will find no rest in the lands beyond, no sacred rites, nor mourning of their kin. Death has come to this place of curses, and death abandons us. We spare them none, for they are jealous of their hearts. Ember murmured the rest of it aloud. We, the deep dwellers, must forever eat their songs. It is so, Kentucky confessed, still avoiding his gaze. What I am to tell you, Ember, you will not like to hear. He cleared his throat. Then oughtn't you to tell me quickly, and be done? She fidgeted, and her breaths came quick and shallow. My people are hungry. Always we hunger. The humming of your flesh. The drumming in your hearts. Of this, I too am partaking. With others of my clan. He was about to say he had expected as much. After all, he had witnessed Sil's coercion in his vision, but before he could remark on this, she spoke over him. We who have no voice must fight for what remains, after the hunters devour the hunted, and content ourselves with the echoes of their song. I tell you before, I am never killing any men, for I take what Sil leaves for me, then. The voiceless are not permitted to eat while the blood runs warm and the song is fresh. Not until the becoming. Ember stared at her, aghast. What is your becoming? He demanded, his voice croaking. When she spoke, it was quick, with grim resolve. To enchant a man, tear out his heart while he yet lives, and consume it before all the clan. He looked into her eyes, wide with fear, and glimpsed his own shocked reflection pooled within them, his much harsher features faintly aglow in the scant golden light of the stone. Kentucky does not lie to Ember, she gasped suddenly, snatching his wrist. Not killing. Only eating. Please believe Kentucky. She does not lie. Never lie to Ember. Not killing. Only eating. There was a frantic fervor to the words, as if they rendered her somehow less culpable for knowingly gnawing the bones of his kin. But it was true. She had not lied. Bile soured his tongue. The illness inclined toward bitterness, which swiftly became disgust. She had lived long amongst a fiendish folk who celebrated the desecration of mankind, indeed, not only celebrated, but it seemed almost a necessity. They were drawn to it for some unholy reason, desperate to taste these songs which so delighted them. He remembered the look in the undead eye of that ancient creature, peering out from beneath his dark cowl with an insatiable hunger. Lusting after Kentucky's immortal beauty and the song of Ember's flesh. And then he bleakly wondered what she wished most to hear. It doesn't matter. I forgive you. Thank you for telling me the truth. In the end, all he could manage was a strangled, I know. Her eyes darted away, and he could no longer see himself reflected within their inky depths. She shivered, lashes fluttering and ears twitching. But, after you left, Ember said slowly, his heart squeezing beneath his ribs at the thought, when you traveled alone. Did you complete your becoming, then? She had devoured his kinfolk of her own free will, perhaps by the hundreds. Whether she had murdered any of them outright should hardly matter after such a revelation. But it did matter. It mattered because he wanted to hold her to her word. Without that fragile foundation of trust they had rebuilt, stone by stone, they would never find the gate, never free themselves from the clutches of the accursed mountain. He could already feel that foundation cracking, crumbling. If it shattered a second time, he would never trust her again. Kentucky's neck was rigid. He could see her pulse at her throat, beating more swiftly than his. She contorted her mouth to hide her fangs again, which faintly muffled her reply. The words were carefully chosen. I have not partaken of the songs of men since I ran from there. But my folk are not to be speaking with yours. Such is the way of my clan, such it always is, and wretched in the eye of Sil I am. So I think to myself, I must strike out alone to find such a one. He allowed himself a faint sigh. Not relief, but something like it. If she had completed her becoming, would she have cared enough to seek out the elder's rumored mountain? Perhaps she might have fallen into lusting after more and more songs, like her wicked sister. He recalled the voracious hunger he had witnessed in the garden, sticky fruit juices dripping from her mouth and chin, smeared up to her elbows. It was all too easy for him to imagine the red syrup of his own veins spattered across her face. Ember waited what he felt was a courteous length of time before asking wearily, You mean, me? No. Her breath was chill, and he shivered, despite the distance between them. There is another. Sil wishes me to fetch him for the becoming. I know that I cannot eat his heart, after all which I have heard. And so I ran away. Ember pressed her fingers between both his hands and waited, but she offered nothing more. At last, when it was clear that she was finished, he said honestly, That was very brave of you. Kentucky snatched her hand away. Do not speak such things, she snapped, with such uncharacteristic fury that Ember lurched backward, placing a hand on the hilt of fish-bitter. Froth flew from her lips with the venomous words. "I am not brave." The sword buzzed faintly beneath his touch, like an angry bee. For the first time since they had met, her fangs flashed in a snarl instead of a grin, but she turned away from him so quickly that he could scarcely comprehend what he had seen. So he shuffled further into the corner and stared in heart-pounding silence as the sirena hissed and spluttered quietly, combing her claws through her tangled hair and pulling out a few thin strands. These she wound around her fingers. After a few moments of this strange self-soothing gesture, she wandered off into garbled siren speech, but he caught two muttered human words. Familiar, soft, and dark. Never satisfied. Chapter 49 Restoration. Kentucky's frantic spitting and muttering ebbed to a tranquil hum. It calmed Ember, though not enough for him to loosen his grasp on fish-bitter. At length, she shifted into a series of achingly sonorous tones, most of which resounded long and low, reaching deeper than he had thought possible for one with such a fair voice as hers. Each breath bent existence around him, whispered to the blood in his veins. He felt strange, at first as if he were floating, and then as if his heart had begun to beat backwards. She blurred before him, wavering like a reflection in the river on a misty morning. First one apparition, then three, then four, infinite figments of the dark-haired sirena smearing together at the edge of his focus. It was the strangest melody she had ever sung in his presence, yet somehow he understood it. It was the song of Kentucky's corporeal form, everything which made her the whimsical sirena, a creature now more known to him than any of the villagers he had left behind, spun round and round in a few whispered notes. Ember was loath to interrupt, but he could hardly stand to listen, haunted by the allure of a thing forever out of reach. The melody was entirely beyond his mortal ken, and still he moved with it. Wished for it. Yearned for the looming madness of her musk and magic to finally overwhelm him, that he might lose himself forever to the loveliness of another worldly woman from the river. His fingers twitched and he coughed against the sudden emptiness within his chest, pulse fluttering faster. After a moment of confusion, he willed himself to withdraw, shuffling across cold stone tiles until he huddled in the darkest corner of the baths. He wiped his damp forehead with the back of his hand as the mirage of many sirenas faded and his pounding heart resumed its normal rhythm, if somewhat more erratically than before. She paused her humming and the shimmer disappeared. "Is that a healing song?" he asked, his voice shaking faintly. "I suppose that is what you will say. But I will say it as a suggestion." "A suggestion? My kind have not the power of those melting stones you found, but I know all the songs of the earth. I know what should be and is not. I remind these twisted things," she explained, licking her finger and sticking it to one of the stubborn blemishes, "that they are not meant to be." The tree stone flickered and danced as she returned to her humming, light heightening and hushing as she moved through different melodies. Ember stared, mesmerized. Its cadence reminded him of bountiful fruit and sweet rushing water. The garden they had so foolishly left behind. "I think," he hesitated, "that siren we fought, when he started chanting, was he also?" "I do not know of that," Kentucky hissed, lip curling. "He speaks black words I am never hearing before, and I do not like them. Let us not remember such a thing." Ember was unused to this quick-tongued side of Kentucky, which took offense so carelessly, and it rattled his composure. She did not lift her head again, but continued her search for new imperfections with her fingers and sharp eyes. One final blister smoothed beneath her touch. She passed her thumb over it several times, clearly basking in the return of her unspoiled beauty. "Why did you stop?" he asked, disappointed in spite of himself. "I am tired," she admitted, and surprised him with a gusting sigh. "The rest will fade, in time." He observed her for a moment, noting the cast shadows beneath her inky eyes and the way her mouth, which curled toward a smile even when at rest, now seemed to droop slightly at each corner. She did appear tired, and he wondered if the magic she had spun to cure her wounds had taken something in return. Then her glance brightened, latching onto him with a startling intensity. He couldn't tell what exactly her black eyes had affixed to, and was startled when she slunk toward him in a crouch, fingers curling toward his throat. Ember put a hand over it and leaned away. "What?" he snapped. His neck ached suddenly, and the touch of his own hand brought back a rush of instinctual fear, bony fingers snatching his throat, a whirl of red hair, spine cracking against the bole of a tree, furious shriek, the fog of his last gasp drifting away into the woods of a cold dreamscape. Am I the reasoning of this? He shook off the memory to see that Kentucky's gaze had darkened. What do you mean? She beckoned him, the intensity of her expression softening as her sweet scent melted his resolve. He reluctantly lowered his hand and she lightly tapped 2 fingers to the hollow of his throat. There is a mark. Her lower lip tightened. I grab you, there. Yes? Ember remembered. Now, it felt like so long ago, but it had only been a day and a night, or a little more. Yes, Kentucky must have bruised his throat, in the hall of whirling dust. It was silly of him to think first of a nightmare. Right. Yes. You did. It's. He shrugged, and swallowed the word fine. I know you were hungry. She hugged herself, retreating from his gaze. Can you? He hesitated, suddenly abashed. She met his eyes again. Can you heal this? He wondered aloud. I mean, could you? If you wanted to? It seemed a personal thing to ask, but she was already shaking her head. There are some within my clan who can do such things, among our own kind. I have not such a talent, and your human song is strange to me. What about memories? Ember ventured, thinking again of Syl's words about Bren. Thoughts, emotions. Can you mend those, too? Shape them, or make them disappear? Kentucky did not answer him right away. To be making something take a shape which is not its own. She hesitated. To unmake a thing. That is a harder task, yes. But you can do it. Shape a person's mind? Her weary gaze flickered to and fro, and when it chanced to touch his, it dropped to the stone. She swallowed visibly as the corners of her eyes tightened. I think, maybe, that is a song for another day. Open, Ember commanded. Kentucky flinched. He spoke with an edge, sometimes, which hadn't been there before. Or perhaps it had been there all along, and she had never noticed? She had some blurred memory of his wrath, when the echoes beguiled them. He scarcely knew her then, and thus it had afflicted her little more than the punishments of the wretched book. Yet ever since he shouted those angry words in the garden, she found herself intimidated by a voice which had always before seemed so soft and gentle. The tongues of men, too, possessed power. Regardless, it should not afflict her so. Syl would never have allowed him to speak to her thusly. You allow it because that is what you deserve. A strain of whispering magic shifted beneath her feet, fragile as a silver thread, and the door grumbled, scraped, and retreated into the wall. Eager to be gone, Kentucky shoved past him, and something crunched underfoot. Bones. Kentucky hissed as a breeze touched her legs, but reassuring fingers brushed her shoulder, and Ember tugged the tattered shirt so that it hung more neatly about her neck. We can always come back, he promised soberly, if we meet with another windstorm. She wavered, and then carefully stepped around the outstretched skeleton. If you say it is so, then it is so, she muttered, snatching one of the flasks from his pack and shaking a few drops water over her hands and neck. Ember walked on as the door rumbled behind her, and she was beset by the fleeting idea of darting back inside and vanishing into the pool forevermore, but before she could act upon it, the door thudded shut and she was trapped outside, with only Ember's steady presence to comfort her. Kentucky's clan had no religious rites or ceremonies dedicated to any deity but themselves, and certainly did not believe in begging Ember's maker for breath. Were they not, as Syl had often boasted, the most powerful creatures in all the mortal realm? Had they not made themselves, long ago? They were the masters of their fate. That is why I am weak, Kentucky thought bleakly, shivering. Seeking aid from others, when I should seek answers within myself, as any faithful siren would. I am least among the faithless of my kin. Still, she could not help but pause to observe the fallen wretch, and a strange feeling welled up in her heart at the sight. For it was this end which, above all other ends, she most feared, He had found no treasure in the mountain stronghold and, with not a single drop to wet his withering throat, had passed alone into the greater darkness. Darkness as the dark of a siren's sleep. Ember was already moving ahead, leather shoes whispering across the mosaic of tiles, but pity rooted her there. Kentucky quickly knelt beside the ancient remains and pressed 2 fingers against the unfortunate siren's forehead, claws tapping the dusty skull. "Sleep, brother," she breathed in her own tongue. The gems above her flickered at the potent words, voices hushed, and a few lingering breezes defiantly napped at her ankles. When she glanced up, her Ember had stopped at the turn of the hall and was waiting patiently, the stone light casting its soft radiance across his face. Kentucky shivered and hurried after him, bundling his shirt more tightly around her shoulders. He was very bold with his looks, now, she noticed. He did not turn pink or glance away, or pretend that she held no fascination for him until he thought she did not see. And Kentucky liked that. She no longer frightened him, and that frightened a small part of her, but in some unfamiliar way, she found she liked that, too. He held out a hand. She hesitated, impressed by the memory of that hand reaching out from the darkness. Their fingers clasped, a familiar touch, and he offered her a tired smile. "Soon," he said quietly. She was not sure what he meant by that, but felt compelled to return it. "Yes," she whispered. "Soon." Chapter 50 A Crown of Weeping Stars. The sleeping city of Northall, which she had at first glimpsed in ink and runes upon the tattered map, made all the dusty splendor which they passed before it fade from Ember's mind like a noonday mist. The polished floors were stained in mottled hues of blue and green, and he had to touch with a finger to assure himself it was indeed stone and not a still river of translucent glass. Intricate murals spanned the walls between monolithic pillars ringed in gold and runes, and brilliant gemstone lanterns dangled from the impossibly tall ceilings. He attempted to decipher those runes as they wandered, but they were ancient and unfamiliar, and he soon abandoned the effort. At length, they came to a place where the polished columns and carvings blended smoothly into the natural crags of the mountain, and the mountain itself opened up before him. Thunder boomed, a ceaseless droning like cicadas in the summertime. The reverberations echoed so that it took him many moments to recognize their sonorous song. A waterfall tumbled somewhere nearby. They came to a place where the crags dipped steeply inward, and then parted to the light of a cool morning. Ember stopped to muffle a gasp, which would have been lost to the crashing falls even without his arm across his mouth. Flat, chiseled steps sprawled up in a lazy twist toward a cleft in the mountain, pillars reaching to the heights. A faint mist drifted lazily over the floating spiral of stone. Not until they had moved close enough to peer through that mist did he notice the faces in the rock. Ember stopped, gripping Kentucky's arm. "Wait," he whispered. "What are those?" She flinched, her startled hiss mingling with his intake of breath. They fell motionless, peering into the haze. Shadows streaked from each rocky pillar in alternating patterns of light and darkness, sunshine catching each droplet cast aloft by the raging torrent. For a moment, the pillars at the top of the steps appeared to him as solemn giants, their gray faces set sternly or smilingly, gray hands clasping gray stone swords, clad in garments olive gray, standing guard over the falls. Upon each gray brow, some soft and some severe, rested a stony circlet shaped like leaf, twig, antler, or twisting wire, and one appeared as a crown of fresh spring flowers. All bereft of color. Yet Ember was convinced they should step forth from their posts at any moment, shaking out their hair and sumptuous garments with a ripple of vibrant tints and hues, and swiftly take up arms against these fools who dared set foot within their hollow kingdom. "I hear no song of a beating heart," Kentucky hushed. "They are only made of stone." As they crept into the broom which rolled forth from the falls, Ember noted that the pillars nearest the base of the stone steps were untouched by chisel or magic. Not all had been given face and human form. The first step, and every step after, was broader than the whole width of his old cabin. He glanced up at the pillars which disappeared into the mist from this perspective, already somewhat breathless at the thought of such a climb. The wardens to his left hand seemed mostly men, and on the right stood mostly women. Both towered above him, but the ethereal figures to the right were shrouded in flowing robes and mystery, while the kings to the left, for Ember could think of no other name by which to know them, had been draped in stony fabrics, belts, and other luxurious trappings or pieces of armor. They had not ascended more than 10 of those steps when they came to the first statue. This figure, alone of all the many sculpted faces which he could see, remained unfinished. It stood upon the right-hand side of the stone steps and faced the daylight streaming down through the spray. She was not striking, not in the way which a siren's beauty struck him, but there was a simpleness and honesty about the carven face which made it equally pleasing to the eye. The spray from the falls coalesced about her hair and stony gaze, darkening the stone. Upon her gentle brow there rested a circlet of ethereal stars. "She's lovely," Ember whispered. Kentucky stepped beside him without a sound. Her head tilted faintly, hair swishing across her shoulder as she tipped her chin upward to gaze into that long-forgotten face. "I think she is sad." He was taken, just then, by how old the Sirena appeared. All her childlike wonder was gone, whisked away by the woes of an ancient creature, bearing the countenance of one intimately acquainted with mortal grief and suffering. When he looked back to the statue, the fair stone mouth was still smiling. But it was a smile which haunted him, and he knew the memory would linger long after their footsteps here had been lost to dust and time. "Come, Ember." Kentucky's sharp voice rang out above the crashing of the falls, bouncing off pillars and chiseled stone steps as she solemnly padded away. Yet Ember hesitated, staring into the strangely familiar and strangely human face with a feeling of wistful emptiness. The emptiness twisted into nameless sorrow as beaded mist dripped from her chin. They passed beyond the waterfall, and its row of silent watchers. A crown of weeping stars Part 2. Smaller stone folk awaited them at the top of the misty steps, chiseled into alcoves here and there, commemorating a great clan of men which had once dwelt among them. Like the giants below, they possessed no song of their own, though faint magical echoes straggled about. Some of these manifested into frustrating glimpses of movement amidst the stoic silhouettes. A spark of light which blinked in Kentucky's periphery, only to disappear as soon as she turned her head. Once she noticed a few golden strands, like pale hair, wisping around a stone figure, but when she peered behind it, there was nothing to be sensed or seen. Only a familiar and effeminate energy which whispered past her grasping claws before that, too, ebbed into darkness. Perhaps I should speak of this figment to Ember. She wondered yet again if they were being followed, and glanced back to her companion. Ember stared down at the rune-marked parchment as he walked, muttering to himself. Occasionally he put out a hand to brush a drifting cobweb or stone pillar from his path. The cobwebs fluttered and disappeared, and he angled his steps away from the pillars when he encountered them. His wanderings reminded Kentucky of a little wooden boat she had once set loose from its mooring, for nothing more than the amusement of watching it bob about the rocky harbor. "Ember." "H.M." She stamped a foot. He glanced up, scratching his bristly chin. "Hullo. Are you seeing something?" she demanded. He took an anxious glance about and turned a full circle. "Seeing what?" "I do not know." "Is it magic?" "I know not." "Where?" "It is gone now." "Then how am I to see it?" He sighed, shaking out the map again. Kentucky stared at him, a sense of foolishness encroaching upon her resolve. She disliked that foolish feeling. It dredged up unpleasant flashes of a feigned smile, the overwhelming bitterness of sage and crushed pine, and hair the color of mortal blood. Likely whatever figment haunted their steps was one of 1,000 fraying spells, intricately woven by those long dead and left to rot in their absence. But that thought brought little comfort. Human magic frightened Kentucky more than the wild things in the forest below the mountain. Twisted paths in the wooded hills were less disorienting to her siren senses than the memories which seethed and slumbered beneath these mountain halls. Best to forget about such things, until there is need to confront them. So she trotted ahead of Ember, weaving rapidly from one side of the hall to the other so that she might peer up at each stony face before he caught up to her. Some of them appeared in the likeness of men, but a few were shrouded in leafy hair, their limbs like winding roots and branches. They reminded Kentucky of the forest spirits from the sleep songs her sister sang, though she had never been so unlucky as to meet with one herself, for all folk of that kind had withered away many long winters past. All of them were, even by the standards of her own kin, very beautiful. But she could not feast upon beauty alone, and her thoughts of late had been overwhelmingly bent upon the pit of her hunger. They drew ever closer to the kitchens Ember had promised, and even that promise of sustenance was enough to refresh her wits, but disappointment awaited them. Ember entered first and moved directly in front of her, shoving away broken glass with his leather-clad feet. Kentucky cautiously followed in his steps. Any good things within reach had long since petrified or crumbled to dust beneath her grasping fingers, and a dull panic curled around her ribs. Only a few sealed vessels peered down from the highest shelf. He righted a falling pair of climbing poles to fetch them. Several rungs cracked beneath his shoes as he ascended, and each time he hesitated, jaw-clenching. Kentucky stood beneath him and hummed for balance, her hands outspread. He shot her a skeptical glance, clinging to the poles with bloodless fingers. "I will be catching you," she assured him. He flushed, but did not look at all convinced. No matter, it would not be pleasant if he fell, but she would keep him from harm regardless. He sequestered most of the vessels in his pack, and was still fussing with one of the lids when he reached the bottom. Kentucky snatched it. A thick jar, heavy and cool to the touch, but small enough to hold in her palm. The faintest scent of sweet summer berries wisped from it. Enchanted, he guessed. "We might have to break it." Crack. With a hollow thunk and a pop, the wooden topper twisted off under Kentucky's ravenous grasp. She tossed it aside, digging her claws into the gooey berries and retrieving a handful of dark deliciousness as it rolled across the floor. She stuffed her fingers in her mouth. Ember's eyes widened. Then he handed her another. "Quick, open this one." They gulped in frantic silence until 3 of the jars had been emptied. Even Ember abandoned all pretense of his usual eating rituals, but when she reached for a 4th jar he wiped his mouth and put out a sticky hand. "We ought to save what's left. It might keep us fed until we reach the gate, if we're careful." He glanced away, but the words were unyielding as he secured the pack and slung it over his shoulder. "I'll hold on to these. For both of us." Kentucky smacked a drop of juice from her nose and eyed him blearily. Resentment gnawed her bones. No. He was wiser now. She would take everything from him and devour it all, the sweet summer berries, his charming sincerity, and above all else that living human heart which sang beneath his ribs, if she could. A Crown of Weeping Stars Part 3. The rooms which had clearly been lived in made Ember uncomfortable, but clothing was now a matter of some importance. His threadbare shirt hung loosely around Kentucky's shoulders, and she was constantly pinching it closed. Likewise, he had no desire to wander about clad in nothing but a pair of dirty trousers. It was cool beneath Sister's Mountain, and he shivered with each mysterious draft which blew through the halls. He paused outside the first open doorway, disturbed that he was invading a personal sanctuary, and one which had clearly belonged to someone of more wealth than he had ever dreamt of having. Kentucky had no such qualms, and swept past him with a pleased hum. Bits of jewelry and broken baubles were scattered about, and a tall wooden cupboard leaned crookedly in one corner, doors ajar. She sniffed, quirked her head, and disappeared into an adjoining alcove. "Where are you going?" "To find the pretty things I smell." He didn't bother to question her logic. When it came to matters of a magical nature her senses were far keener than his. Many personal odds and ends were scattered about the room, but once Ember's eyes lit upon the bed, he couldn't tear them away. There was nothing remarkable about it. Only a wrinkled blanket, and a faint depression in the center of the mattress, as if someone had gotten up and left a few moments before they entered. It must have been more than 1,000 years since, but if he touched it, he would not have been surprised to find it warm from the lingering presence of its former occupant. The notion haunted him. For a short while he listened to the faint creak of cupboard doors opening and thumping shut again as Kentucky scurried here and there, collecting anything which caught the attention of her bulbous siren eyes. Many belongings had obviously been preserved by magical methods, but most were not. Each item of interest seemed to wither beneath his fingertips, and those that did not crumble to dust occasionally let out a faint creak, weathered cracks appearing on their surface, as if for 1,000 years they had been under a spell of forgetting, and his touch had reminded them how old they truly were. At last he came to the crooked cupboard, and flung the carved doors aside with a puff of dust and a coughing fit. A bundle of embroidered fabric greeted him, pristine despite its age, and he smoothed the golden trim between his fingers. His excitement quickly ebbed as he realized these materials had not been made for simple folk. Ember. He glanced up as Kentucky reappeared in the doorway and held aloft a string of glossy pearls. She bared her fangs at him, lips curling, and pressed them to her heart. "Yes, they are very nice." But Kentucky had already moved on to the bottles she had gathered from the adjacent room. He could just make out a few of the runes and symbols. They appeared to be herbal in nature, such as basil, or thyme, and a few others which were foreign but reminded him of trees. She shook one next to her ear, listening intently, and then uncorked it. Her eyes fluttered wide and she held it to her nose. He tensed. "Be careful!" With an exultant shout, Kentucky dumped the oil over her head and tipped her chin back, closing her eyes as a dizzying fragrance of crushed rose petals washed across the room. Ember stumbled back, waving his hand in front of his face. "Not magic," she cried, turning to him with a mouth-open grin. Shimmering oil dripped from her lips and the end of her nose, and she let out a croaking laugh. "There are many, many flowers in this bottle." "Maker's breath." He coughed, glaring through watery eyes. A vague memory beset him of the village healer toting about similarly pungent bottles of scented oils. "Are you mad?" "I am not upset with you," she said calmly, licking a little of the oil from her lips. "Why should you be thinking so?" "Not mad, mad," he spluttered. "You're quite clearly meant to use one drop at a time." "Not, arg, all of it at once." She blinked, glancing at the bottle, and then eyed him skeptically. "You say this before, about the honey. And I was right. Do you wish to know what I think?" "No." "I think you are afraid of sweet things, Ember," she accused with a sniff. "I like sweet things," he said, careful to keep well away from the fragrant sirena as he crossed the room. "I like them in reasonable portions." Drops of oil pattered on the faded rug at her feet. "And which of us shall say what is reasonable?" she challenged suddenly, a gleam in her eye. "Ember, who is living one place only, never seeing even the ocean, or Kentucky, who comes from far away, and travels many lands, and has seen so many things. At least Ember has a dram of common sense," he snapped, feeling childish. "So what if I haven't been so many places as you? I bet I know things you don't." Kentucky lifted one shoulder in a careless shrug. Ember turned back to the cupboard, his face flushing. Her drifting shadow was preceded by the suffusion of crushed roses, and she reached around him with her slender fingers, hooking a claw into the fabric. The scent of her musk and the essence of flowers completely overwhelmed the senses as her oily fingers trailed across a different garment, woven of greens and blues. She pulled it gently from the clothing cupboard and shook it with an exultant shout. A frilled dress unfurled, spilling across the stone floor as if a waterfall had sprung from her gathered arms. Before he could open his mouth to protest, Kentucky was already measuring the thin sleeves and plunging neckline against her own curvaceous frame. "Impractical," he sighed. It must have been worth all the coin that he had scrounged from his nets on the river and more. For all its splendor, he could hardly imagine anyone dragging such a wealth of material through the dusty mountain halls. She huffed a few siren words, offering him a reproachful glance. "If you can shorten it, tear the cloth, perhaps." The sirena held it up to her figure, took hold of the garment where it fell below her knees, and tugged viciously. Only a single loose thread dripped free. It was clearly well made to have been spared the moth-eaten fate of its fellows, and would take time and effort to unravel. Kentucky's ears drooped. She let it fall to the floor in a crumpled heap. Guilt smote him. "I suppose, if you really like it, I no longer want it," she said primly, straightening her borrowed shirt and tangling her fingers into her hair. "After all, what is the worth of a thing, if it is not practical?" He felt soundly mocked, but hooked his thumbs through his belt and left the room without another word. A crown of weeping stars Part IV. Maker's breath. I thought it was another snake. Ember stood in the middle of the hallway, rubbing chills from his arms as he examined the ropey object which had tripped him in the dark. It appeared to be dull green in coloration, sprouting tiny leaves, winding along a bend in the corridor. From beyond it drifted a soft ruddy glow. As he advanced, more vines could be seen, and the leaves grew broad. The vines themselves shimmered faintly, and elegant flowers opened their lilac throats with a dull rustle as he passed. "Are they friendly?" he inquired, concerned. Kentucky hummed in question, shifting the bundle of clothing beneath her arm. They had recently located what Ember guessed had once been servant quarters, and he had rifled through muted fabrics until he encountered a sturdy cream-colored tunic and a pair of new trousers. There were no women's clothing or anything of the boyish fit, and the Sirena had stubbornly taken nothing for herself. They seemed so. The bloom shrank away from her reaching claws, and, once she touched it, crumpled into dust. She glanced up at him, and then quickly ducked her head, shrugging one shoulder. But Ember hardly noticed. His eyes were already drifting to a broad stone door. It had partially crumbled away, and behind it wound a mass of tangled, twisted greenery. Over the passing years, the vines had eroded the barrier, and freed themselves to bloom wherever they wished. And the light which glowed through the leafy tendrils was too warm and inviting to ignore. "I'm going to look inside," he decided suddenly. Kentucky shrugged, and he sensed her annoyance. Is she still upset about the dress? It seemed a strange grievance, but he couldn't be bothered about that now. As he stepped over what remained of the door, he found to his delight that the curtain of plants gave way easily beneath his touch, curling up toward the ceiling or shifting to either side of the door with soft creaks and dry rustles. The lingering scent of cedarwood swirled through the room with a faint puff of dust and pollen his footsteps raised, illuminated by a few streaks of reddish light, the dying rays of a summer sunset. The afterglow crept through a broad crack which ran the length of the cavern wall, smattering the threadbare rugs upon the floor. His heart thrilled within him and he rushed past the trailing vines. Upon closer inspection, the crevice was too precipitous and too far up the mountainside for either of them to safely crawl through it and descend to the bottom. He shuddered at the thought of attempting it. Still, it was broad enough to sit on, and just wide enough for him to lean out and get a good look at the surrounding landscape. A breath of fresh, pine-scented air tousled his matted curls and he inhaled deeply, basking in the faded sunshine. From here he could see the tops of the trees. Tears filled his eyes, welling up from someplace unfamiliar as he observed the endless forest spread below. He put out a hand to catch the light between the webbing of his fingers. It looked much the same as his parting glimpse of the sister's footstool, but these woods blanketed a much steeper incline and seemed even darker, if possible. No, more desolate. Foreboding. Most of the woods nearby appeared to be new growth, but the tallest pines which clung to the steep hillside were twisted and scarred, their branches bare and stony. Beyond that, far, far below, he could see a line where the trees were thinner, and a road might once have wound through the woods. And further still, across the road, the faintest shimmer of a lake. Ember wasn't sure if it were the sight or sudden breeze which made him shiver. Directly below his perch, metal glinted against the rocks. From this distance it resembled the haft of a broken sword, and a few rusted fragments of armor. He swallowed hard, imagining what must have driven the man to make such a leap. A startled cry came from behind him. He whipped around, heart pounding. Kentucky stood in the middle of the crumbling doorway, pale face twisted in a look of abject terror. "Leaving?" she hissed, a whispering shriek. Her black eyes shimmered, moving imperceptibly between him and the open fissure. "It's a long way down, from here," he managed weakly, stepping aside. "Want to see?" She tensed. "See what?" "The forest." Her shoulders relaxed, but the apprehension lingered. "No. I am seeing many trees before." He thumped his chest as his heart skipped a few beats. "Of course." As she eyed the ledge warily, Ember allowed himself a more thorough glance about the room. In one corner rested a floor-length mirror, and he turned away as the sound of shattering glass echoed in his mind. The lush leaves and twigs appeared to have been sourced from 4 twisted poles which might once have been bedposts. Though half the cloth drapery was bleached from years of sunlight, the rest appeared eerily untouched for having been exposed to the elements. Another breeze swept off the ledge and rattled a few dead leaves which clung stubbornly to the older branches. An abandoned sparrow's nest rested at one corner, perhaps from the previous summer, and he now noticed bird droppings on the rugs and the window ledge. But at the foot of the bed he glimpsed something that looked like a wooden box. Over the passing years the bedposts had grown roots and branches well over it. He brushed them aside, and as before, they moved easily beneath his touch. It was not locked. He unlatched it with a gentle creak and lifted the lid. At first it appeared to be empty, but then his calloused fingers chanced upon a bit of woolen fabric. "Hullo! What's this?" He said it only to capture Kentucky's attention. He sensed she was aware of this ploy, but she peered through the vines for a better look. It was a simple fitted shift the color of damp stone, with a square neckline and a hem of reasonable length, constructed for everyday wear, not a pretentious display of riches. Beneath it lay outer garments fashioned of the same material, a cloak or robe of some sort, which he left where it had been folded. "Well made and practical," he assured her wryly, handing her the garment. Kentucky accepted it without a word, passing him the tunic and trousers in turn. Then she set about unfastening the laces. Her nose wrinkled and her eyes narrowed, but an offer of assistance might be taken as an insult in this unflattering mood, so he left her to unravel the mysteries of the garment. He had not even finished tugging the tunic over his head when soft footsteps echoed in the hall behind him, followed by a wordless exclamation. Ember glanced over his shoulder to see Kentucky spin a full circle amidst the carpet of greenery, swaying from side to side and swishing the hem of the dress around her legs. It fell halfway below her knees, and she had rolled the snug sleeves past the crooks of her elbows. It wasn't a perfect fit, but her change in aspect was refreshing, and the unexpected sight tugged a grin from him. She dimpled and grasped the loose folds of the skirt, fabric bunching under her tight grip. "Does this please Ember?" A deceptively simple question. Was she inquiring after the practicality and fit of the dress, or whether she pleased him? Perhaps both? Her smile ebbed as he hesitated. A fay being captured by the domesticity of mortal attire was, indeed, strangely captivating. It tamed the wildest parts of her, and yet she somehow seemed more foreign than ever before. As he worked his jaw in a silent struggle for words, her eyes sparkled again. "Are you pleased?" he said uncertainly. She whistled a few contented notes and smoothed her hands across the fabric, flattening the creases which the shapely garment had acquired from being folded and forgotten. He touched the soft hem of his own dusty tunic, and then held out an arm, heart pounding. "It's only a change of clothes." Though the dress hugged her figure, it was hardly as scant as Brent's jerkin and trousers or Ember's tattered shirt had been. Nonetheless, there was something demure and illusory about it. She tossed her head, long black hair glistening in the light of the flowers, and the scents of rose oil and forest musk drifted across the hall. Then she took his arm in both damp hands and matched her steps to his, her earlier disappointment entirely forgotten. The crashing mist awaited the return, now shot through with moon glow and scattered shadows. Faint stars watched over the craggy mountain, visible where the falls cascaded down from the heights. Kentucky appeared transfixed by the splashing spray. She untied the flask from his pack, gulping at it, and patted some of the water onto the lingering sores around her neck. Then she flattened herself along the stony step and stretched out her arm over the stair until the water flowed over her wrist, filling the empty container. Ember watched in silent consternation, baffled by her lack of fear. She swiped a lock of hair from her brow, sitting cross-legged in her damp dress and smudging the mist across her face. Then she took a long gulping drink, handing the flask to Ember. Her eyes appeared larger and darker than usual. He took the flask, and slimy fingers brushed his knuckles. "Good night, Kentucky," he said softly. To his surprise, the stone light flickered and dimmed at the sound of his voice. It was the first time it had acknowledged him in any way. The moonlight refracting through the spray was just enough by which to see the shapes of the guardian pillars and the quiet shadow of the Serena. "Good night," Kentucky sighed, turning the words over with a somber thoughtfulness. Her absent humming floated into silence, and the stone grew colder in his hands. But he could not put out of his mind the vision of that sad, fair face, and her crown of weeping stars, looking out over the waterfall for an endless age. And he felt her staring down from above, even as he wandered through the forest of his dreams. Chapter 51 from the Deep Part 1. The grand halls grew ever more alive as they ventured deeper into the labyrinth of the forgotten city, echoes of the many who had dwelt within the mountain, and vanished long ago. Fewer signs of battle and makeshift barricades awaited them, but Ember discovered a dark stain and shattered glass where a drink had been spilled, tattered scrolls, a book with half the pages missing, and even a nearly hidden writing nook in one of the central halls, complete with a polished desk and a jar of ink. The wooden chair had been broken, but he stepped around its skeletal remains for a better look. Several leaves of paper rested beneath a layer of dust. He drew his thumb across a splatter where the runes ended, and read, "We lie here in the waking hours at first light, a single quotidian day devours all the soft and pleasant things which morning sweetly to us brings." Scratched out scribblings beneath those words marked the poem unfinished. The ancient ink seemed as fresh as the day it was uncorked, and retained all the properties of its past life despite the passage of time. Kentucky entreated Ember to blot a few runes on the parchment. She requested his name in letters, and then hers as best he could manage, and then the word she had recently learned, contentment. He thought it presumptuous to mar the page, yet couldn't help himself but to indulge her fleeting interest. Occasionally their passing tripped strange spells both beautiful and terrifying, and each time he perceived it as a threat and retrieved fish butter. The runes sparkled eagerly beneath his touch, and he couldn't shake the notion that the little sword was somehow disappointed whenever he hid it away again. Most impressive among these illusory encounters were a flurry of luminous butterflies which leaped up and swarmed to the ceiling when they stepped upon patterned tiles. At first Kentucky snatched and grabbed at them, frantically stuffing her fingers into her mouth. Only after she realized they had no substance did she stand very still, blinking rapidly in disappointment as they fluttered around her head, and then laughed, dancing barefoot across the floor. They sprinted through the hall together as a storm of colorful wings swirled around them, scattering into the darkness above. That had been the last of their carefree moments, for his companion had not smiled since. He plied her with extra food, saving a few berries or dried leaves from his meals, but she consumed those offerings with a disquieting stare. Not openly hostile, but something he could not quite grasp simmered behind her eyes. That she kept mostly quiet during their working hours, with only a nod or a shrug and her habitual lullabies, was the most unsettling. If she had been particularly cross that day it bled over into her siren song, for his visions, though they did not frighten him, were nonetheless woven of uncertainty and strangeness, dark and stifling depths or twisted, tangled woods. He wondered if some of these peculiar dreams reflected places she had been, but could never quite summon the courage to inquire. She did stop him several times, abruptly, to ask if he had seen a spark of gold in a darkened corner, or heard the echo of a woman's voice. Ember cast his glance about, but noticed nothing amiss. Her questions left him more unsettled than the dreams. "When we find a way out of this place," he whispered one night, hoping to affirm their silent agreement, "you're coming with me." "Yes." Kentucky buried her face in her hands, shoulders slumped, and dragged her claws through her hair. Her fingers fidgeted, and her lashes twitched. "Kentucky?" He half expected her to reassure him with her old sing-song, "No harm will come to you, Ember." Instead, she gave a weary sigh, and turned away. "What will you have me say?" "That we'll leave together," he said, fighting the heavy silence which her words had pressed upon him. "That you'll stay with me, no matter what." She rubbed her arm across her eyes and shrugged, as if his thoughts were nothing to her. "Is that truly what you wish? Isn't that what you want?" He pressed, hoping for a reply. It was long in coming. "There is a wisdom among my people, that men might better choose their wishes with great care, lest the flighty winds should hear them and grant them what they seek. Ember opened his mouth, but found he had no strength with which to protest. Her words were harsh and hollow, and his blood ran cold in the current which flowed beneath, reminding him what she was, and what she was capable of achieving with her words alone. One dark eye fixed to him as she peered through a curtain of tangled hair. His spine tingled. "Decide what you wish for, Ember, and do not speak upon it until it is firm within your heart." They were near enough to the surface of the earth that Kentucky could sense the early morning sun. Warmth sifted through layers of cold rock above, the song of the chilled dew seeping into the cavern. It was far away, a blurred impression lingering at the furthest reaches of her awareness, yet her senses were heightened beyond their usual ken, for all things distant she had slowly brought into sharp clarity, exploring the vast reaches of the mortal mountain stronghold with the taste of the dusty air upon her tongue, the polished stone beneath her, the drifting echoes of her absent humming. For something new shivered the stagnant air. Whispers. Whispers which had kept her awake throughout the night. But not the whispers of stone and bone, nor even the disembodied fragments of the drifting sparks which flashed at the edge of her sight now and then. It was a resonance. A chorus which called to her, pulled at the gaping hole within. She closed her eyes, focusing all her powers of attention on the sounds and sensations beneath the mountain. Each time the whispers subsided she was gripped with an eagerness to hear those melodies once more, to be sure she had not only, in her ravenous desire, imagined them. Yes. Yes, they were real. Kentucky had grown accustomed to Ember's steady presence, such that his song had become almost secondary, an afterthought to his fumbling words and actions. The seductive hum of his flesh was a temptation she had endured in secret for many months, gorging herself on berry bushes and the fish from the river. She was numb to it, now. Yet all children of the ocean knew the cry of a human soul. Most knew the taste. Syl lusted after it. Her appetite was insatiable, her habits gluttonous. Many, many men had she devoured in her pursuit of satiation, and evermore she hungered. Kentucky could see an image of her sister then, as clearly as if she loomed before her, but this time the sinking feeling her presence usually summoned forth was suppressed by a sense of delicious triumph. She imagined Syl growing smaller, weaker, crouching in the mud with a trembling stare of hopeless jealousy as her younger sister towered above her, strong and fearless and wise. Having tasted the soul of man. "You once devoured everything I cherished," she would say, smiling down with the selfsame smile which Syl had so often cast upon her in the wake of a particularly clever or devastating lecture. "Now, it is finally I who am the first to know the savor of true bliss." Kentucky ground her claws into the stone. Thinking. Brooding. Slowly, softly, a faint beatific smile pressed upon her mouth. "All these many moons my sister has drawn breath. Still she cannot see the possibilities which lie just out of reach, beyond her lustful whims. Yet I, the youngest, the one they cursed for a fool, I have endured, and in the end, I will know no hunger. For I shall become more powerful than them all." From the Deep Part 2. Kentucky was well used to erring in both thought and purpose. Always she had suffered the scorn of her sister and the many elders of Clan Vlee, until some whim of the winds, be it fair or foul, had guided her footsteps to the valley below Ember's mountain. Even now, the ill-fated trust she once placed in her sister had shown itself once more in the dreams of immortal man. That trust was her greatest failure, and it stalked her wherever she trod, a mistaken confidence which had ended in the death of the only elder who found her worthy of small kindnesses, in the choking cloud of blood and entrails, in the dregs of a bitter soup. Her lip twitched. No. She will never lay claim to it, to him. I will see to that. One of Syl's many adages returned to her, then, fear was merely a hindrance. Kentucky must embody the confidence she envied if she was to unbury those true things which the lost elder had promised her, secrets which had long lain forgotten. The air stirred with the muffled sounds of crinkling parchment. Kentucky flickered an ear, annoyed. Suddenly a dull pressure encircled her upper arm, yanking her back to the present moment. She opened her eyes, fangs bared, hissing as the rush of clamorous voices vanished with her focus. "Kentucky?" A blurry face clarified before her. "Ember. Were you asleep?" Kentucky hesitated, her tongue against her teeth, and chose the harmless lie, yes. He relaxed, sitting back on his heels and dragging his fingers through his hair. "Ha! Sorry to startle you, but I've been looking over our map again, and—" He shrugged carelessly. "If luck holds, which I suppose so far it has, given that we're still alive, I might have found something to take your mind off your troubles." She sat up, combing her own hair with her fingers, and sniffed. "I have no troubles." "Oh, come off it." Kentucky turned to Ember and was surprised to see him glaring at her in clear annoyance. "I know what's bothering you, so there's no use pretending." She stiffened, but the alarm ebbed as swiftly as it had come. If he knew her true intentions, he would be far, far away, and running still. Instead, he shifted closer. His frown gentled. "I am sorry we haven't found your treasure yet, Kentucky. I know it's why you came here, how much it meant to you, and maybe there's still a chance. I don't want you to be hungry all the time, either. So, it's in my best interests to help you find whatever you're looking for. You see?" Kentucky blinked. "But—" He lifted a finger. "As I said, I've been looking over this map, and I think, well, get up and follow me." "Why?" "You'll see soon enough," he promised, shuffling to his knees and strapping the pretty sword across his back. "It's not far." "What is not far?" she murmured, rising and brushing the dust from her gray skirt. "Where are we going?" "To celebrate." "What are we celebrating?" He finished hoisting the pack up over his shoulders and stood there for a moment, tilting his head at her with a sudden smile. "We're almost out of here, that's what. Only a few days more of dust and darkness. And then, sunlight." Kentucky could not feign a smile in return, but Ember turned and trudged down the hall, beckoning with a wave of his hand. "And sunlight," he said more seriously, "is a thing worth celebrating." "I suppose," muttered Kentucky, twitching her ears and shaking her head as she tried to catch another strain of the whispers. "We'll be all right, Kentucky." Kentucky shut her dry, scratchy eyes for a moment. What would she do if the gate to the forest beyond did open for him? His wish for her to accompany him into the bright sunlight was only eclipsed by her potent desire to keep him by her side, beneath the mountain, until she had sated her hunger. If he hearkened not to her pleas, then what was she to do? Break her vow a second time and sing him into agreement? You have done it before. But never again could she mangle the mind of her Ember. His anger, tears, and bitter words haunted her, forcing her to carefully weigh and balance every decision she had made from that point forward. More urgently, if the path was barred, would they not starve to death? Could they somehow return to the garden? That passage had almost killed her once. She touched the scars on her neck, and shivered. She needed time, to think, to decide. And now that their path together was nearing its end, time was in short supply. It took them almost a full day to reach Ember's surprise, and when they did, Kentucky was not overly impressed by it. Another door stood beside the road, which had shifted from smooth polished stone into something more like the cobbled human streets along the coast, and it appeared to be hewn from gray pieces of polished oak, which had been bound together with beveled bars. An iron ring was affixed to one side, reminding her of other doors which she had seen, and other nests of men. It was strange that mortals thought such trappings offered some protection. Perhaps it would dissuade a clever bear, or another man, but a siren's tongue could not be stilled by a simple latch. "Open!" Ember cried, a welcome distraction from her unwelcome thoughts. The door did not move. He frowned, stepping closer, and repeated the command. Then he took the iron ring in one hand and gave 3 slow raps upon the door. It moaned and squeaked, yet did not budge. When at last he placed his fingers against the oak, perhaps feeling for a hidden mechanism, it quietly creaked inward. Oh! A pink hue crept across Ember's cheeks and the tips of his ears, and he shoved the door open with an embarrassed hem. It was already open. "Well, that was easier than I thought it would be." He held the tree stone aloft, casting its light upon a solid wall of barrels and crates. A few of them had been propped up near the entrance, but the whole room smelled of dust and food. Kentucky scampered ahead with a cry of delight, throwing the lid off a nearby barrel and cramming her hands into it. Dried fish. An acrid tang of smoke clung to the barrel. When she took a bite, the meat turned to tasteless ash in her mouth. She coughed, and tried to swallow, but it was chokingly dry. Here, Ember tossed her the flask and kicked the lid off another barrel. Kentucky silenced her coughs with a few gulps, and then padded across the room to Ember. The barrel was packed with straw and glass jars. He reached inside, pulling one out and brushing the dust from the surface. Kentucky inspected it. "Honey," he said triumphantly. And that's not all, but Kentucky had already removed the lid and was shoving honey into her mouth. Crisp honeycomb and dried herbs had been packed into the jar, mostly fragrant purple flowers the elders of her clan referred to as lahana, the drowsy petals. They flavored the entire gooey meal with a dreamlike potency. The other foodstuffs had mostly gone off, as Ember put it, and so they had to make do with the honey alone to preserve what remained in their pack. By the time they had finished, Kentucky had nearly forgotten her many woes. Ugh! Ember pushed a half-empty jar across the tiles. "The first bite was nice, but I do feel rather ill." Kentucky licked her fingers and scooped out another handful. Man was never meant to eat so much honey in one sitting. Said Kentucky, her senses singing in delight at the sweet syrup, crunchy wax, and seemingly endless supply of it. "I am of the siren kind, and we eat what we please. Here, you can have the rest of mine." Kentucky finished his jar while he explored the pantry, and when he returned he was carrying 2 bottles made of dark glass in his hands and wearing a delighted grin. She recognized the shape at once, from their first and last meal together at his wooden nest by the river, and eagerly held out her sticky hands. "Wine," he announced smugly, handing her one of the bottles and sitting cross-legged on the floor beside her. "The cure to every ailment. I told you this would lift your spirits, didn't I? Admit it. Your Ember is practically a sage." From the Deep Part 3. He removed the cork with a hollow pop, and Kentucky did the same. Ember lifted his bottle, but instead of drinking from it, he held it out and waited, staring intensely. Kentucky lifted her chin and blinked at him, tipping her head. What did that signify? "Cheers," he said, nodding at her bottle. Comprehending, Kentucky quickly gulped at the fermented berry juice before imitating his motion. She twitched as Ember leaned forward and tapped the bottle necks together with a pleasant clink. "To Siren treasure," he exclaimed suddenly, taking a hearty swig. A shiver worked its way from the base of Kentucky's neck to the tips of her toes. Before she could determine whether he had meant it as a mockery, he lifted the bottle again. "And a very aged wine. Ah! Cheers to that which is good." Kentucky lifted her bottle and clinked it against his, enjoying the wispy note which hovered in the air. "To fish," she said rather bitterly, still disappointed from her encounter with the first barrel. Ember let out a startlingly infectious laugh and downed another mouthful. "To fish," he agreed. "And, honey," Kentucky said, clinking his bottle and swigging again. "Honey. Huh, yes. And to the bees, who make the honey. And, to the ocean." Ember sobered, clinking the bottles together. "To the ocean." His expression brightened somewhat. "And the tree, in the garden." "To the tree," Kentucky relented, a pang of regret stifling her joy. When they had cheered everything from spring flowers to the first snows of winter, and Ember and Kentucky were both sat in silence attempting to think of the next worthy cheer, she took a moment to observe her companion. The wine, she noticed, was beginning to have a very agreeable effect upon Ember. He was more congenial than ever, unguarded, enthusiastic. It had no such effect on Kentucky, that she could tell. For a moment she worried that this too was an effect of the drink, but it did make her ears buzz and her fingertips vibrate most pleasantly, as before. She felt very alive, and was happy to share another uniquely human experience with Ember. He hesitated, wrinkling his forehead as if the appropriate words had escaped him. His blue eyes pierced her, like the sky reflecting in a frozen lake. "To us," he said firmly. Kentucky held her breath for a moment, wondering. All thoughts of the distant whispers flew from her mind. He extended the bottle. She completed his cheer with a faint clink. "To us." Having said his piece, Ember fell very still, reclining against one of the barrels and letting the mostly empty bottle rest beside him on the cobblestones. Kentucky hummed. After several moments of silence, he slipped the rest of the way to the floor, and his breaths grew deeper and softer. Kentucky lifted her bottle once more, though Ember was not awake to share her cheer. "To men," she whispered, draining the rest of the berry juice in silence and in shadow. Night had fallen above the Two-Head Mountain, and the caverns had cooled. Kentucky sat beside her sleeping Ember, awake in the darkness, listening to the otherworldly echoes. Strange that he had made no mention of them. Perhaps they were meant for siren ears alone. Cold, quiet resolve slipped into her heart while he rested, and yet she waited. She must be certain he would not arise. Go to them. I must go to them. Kentucky brushed a hand across Ember's scruffy beard. She wondered, not for the first time, at how different it appeared from the smooth and hairless faces of her kin. Coarse, bristly, but not, she concluded, unpleasant to touch or to look at. She inhaled a draught of his musky scent, straightening the cloth of his simple tunic. Must arise. Seek them out. She dug her claws into the material for a moment, sniffling, and closed her eyes. If she were his friend, she would certainly awaken him, Ember, lovely Ember, who had suffered so much with such a little murmuring. They would decide together what path to take, for the whispers which beckoned were almost certainly those of his own people. But he would ask her questions, and she could no longer withhold her true intent. If the opportunity to reclaim what had been lost presented itself, she must not let even Ember stand in her path. "You're selfish, and cruel." Kentucky blinked rapidly. Why could she not forget those bitter words, and more urgently, the bitter truth behind them? "How can you say that we're friends, and then take everything I ever loved from me? I'll never see Isabel again." Isabel, she resided among those of his clan. Kentucky remembered her, now. A plain face she had at first found insignificant. The woman in the woods, who had come to warn him of danger. They had not seemed so very close. Still, she had been Ember's friend, by his own declaration, since long before Kentucky had ever wandered to their peaceful valley. Syl had stolen Bren from her forever, and tarnished Kentucky's image in the eyes of Clanville. Was she no better than her sister, after all? The only thing you care about is finding your damn treasure. If we were really friends, you'd have told me the truth from the start. She sniffed again. No, he would not understand. Perhaps he would leave her, and then all would be lost. Ember stirred in his sleep and she yanked her hand away, shifting back across the floor. A profound sense of shame crumpled her shoulders, as if she had done something forbidden. Had she? He did not open his eyes, but he did mumble her name. Kentucky took a breath. "What is it?" he whispered, clearing his throat and swallowing twice. She watched him carefully, heartbeat quickening, and then tapped his wrist with 2 fingers. "It is nothing, Ember. Return to your sleeping." He remained quiet, listening for a few moments more, and then relaxed into his former position, tucking a hand under his neck and sighing through his nose. The glowing tree stone nearly slipped from his palm, and she absently folded his fingers around it. More echoes brushed her skin and ears. Impossibly beautiful. And impossible to resist. Kentucky hummed a song of tranquility and deep thoughts of the earth, and any tension which remained in Ember's body fled him at once as he sank into a dark and restful sleep. "Dream," she crooned, lifting her fingers and rising. He did not make a sound as she crept over his still form and across the cobbled path, her steps silent and her movements careful. Snail skin. Kentucky covered her mouth to stifle a whimper. She fled the last few steps to the great oaken door, her feet pattering quietly on the stone. When she glanced over her shoulder, he lay where she had left him. There he would sleep until she returned. She wished only to look, to glimpse, just once, with her waking eyes, what she had heard in the darkness, and discover what manner of man or otherling was waiting there. If she alone could find the answers she sought, then Ember's part in her half-woven plans might not be required after all. Grim relief swept through her at the thought. Yes. That was good. Perhaps someday, her Ember could return to his Isabel, and Kentucky would hunger no more, and be satisfied. and then they would both be happy. Kentucky slipped beyond the open door, shutting it with a sonorous creak. The echoes left a trail through the stone, as clear as footprints on a forest path to the eyes and ears of her kin. When she stepped into the murk, the whispers rattled away into deeper halls and darker rooms, beckoning whosoever would hearken to their cries. A fine greenish mist settled over the stones as she walked, and she shivered as the hem of her dress swished it away. Deeper, snail skin. You must delve deeper,